Hello everybody, my name is Maikeru and welcome to the Mountaineers YouTube channel. Today we're going to be taking a look into the Zelda universe timeline in order to find out where and when Breath of the Wild fits in. Since it was announced for the Wii U about 5 years ago, people have been trying to figure this out like crazy, and since the game dropped, there's no answer. Hopefully my theories and research and ideas have come together and given you something definitive to look at. Without further ado, let's get right into it. With the Nintendo Switch only a couple weeks old, as well as its launch day counterpart, the Breath of the Wild, I feel like I've given everyone enough time to sit down and enjoy their new shit before dropping some crazy knowledge nuggets on them. But I've waited long enough. I've been deeply invested in the timeline of The Legend of Zelda for years now, and when Zelda U was announced, 4 years ago, I was immediately excited to find out where it fits in the grand scheme of things. And just like Nintendo loves to do, they're making us wait. So fuck it. Let's figure this out for ourselves, shall we? Okay, so as most people know at this point, the Zelda timeline is a total mess. It starts off linear with the Skyward Sword, Minish Cap, the Four Swords, and Ocarina of Time. However, Ocarina splits the timeline into 3 separate pieces. I'm going to say time a lot in this video, so just relax and get used to it. Anyway, Timeline 1, where Link defeats Ganon and returns to his child form to live out his full life. This is the Child Link timeline, and is comprised of Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, and the Four Swords adventures. 2. The Fallen Hero or Downfall timeline, in which Link dies during the final fight of Ocarina and Ganon is victorious. This timeline includes, in order, A Link to the Past, Oracle of Ages, Oracle of Seasons, Link's Awakening, A Link Between Worlds, The Legend of Zelda, and Zelda 2, Link's Adventure. And 3. The Adult Link timeline. This is the continuation of the end of Ocarina, where Link killed Ganon, and takes place in the Hyrule, where Link disappears after the Great Battle to become a child again. This is a timeline in which Hyrule is flooded and the Wind Waker takes place, followed by the Phantom Hourglass and the Spirit Tracks. Do we got it? Good. Now there are a ton of events that take place in between these games that are important, but I don't want to stretch this out going into those details. I will put links to those videos in the description so we can focus on the point. Where does Breath of the Wild fit into the Zelda universe timeline? That answer is incredibly complicated, so let's take a look at what we do know. Now I may get into very minuscule spoiler territory here for the Breath of the Wild, and I may spoil the ending of some of the previous games. So if you do not want these to be spoiled for you, this is your warning. Breath of the Wild takes place in what could be described as a post-apocalyptic Hyrule. 100 years before the start of the game, Calamity Ganon wakes from whatever hibernation he was in to destroy the kingdom. In an effort to thwart his evil intentions, Link, Zelda, and 4 champions of Hyrule team up to take Ganon down with the help of ancient Sheikah guardians and the 4 ancient beasts. Their efforts fail, and Calamity Ganon takes control of the guardians and the beasts, instantly gaining a mechanized army and fucking up everyone's day. Link himself is downed and sent to the Nintendo version of a Bacta tank like Luke in Empire after the Wampa kicks his ass for a nice 100-year spa treatment. During Breath of the Wild, we're given 2 distinct time points. The first is 100 years after what I just explained. That's the game you're actually going to be playing. Stay tuned for my review for more on this. And the second is 10,000 years before any of this happened. This is when Hyrule was at the peak of its technology. Okay, so we have a 10,000 year gap between one Ganon sighting and the next. The second sighting, the one that takes place after the 10,000 years, is the prelude to Breath of the Wild, which takes place 100 years after that. One thing you may find weird is that most people from 100 years ago are still alive, so we're left with a question: how long do Hylians live, and what the fuck is a Hylian anyway? Well, to make it brief, Hylians are essentially sacred humanoids created in the image of the old gods. They have pointed ears in order to hear the voices of the gods, and apparently they live a long fucking time. There are instances across the games of normal characters living up to 200 years and some far longer. So let's just assume that on the low end, Hylians live twice as long as human beings. Still, given the average lifetime of a Zelda character, 10,000 years would feel like about 5,000 years to a human. Maybe less if Hylians live even longer than we've realized. The question is that enough time to turn past events into antiquated tales of an advanced civilization? With that knowledge, we now have to look at what makes something a legend. Let's take the Judeo-Christian religions for instance. Abraham, the first of the 3 patriarchs of Judaism, which far outdates Christianity, was said to live 4,000 years ago. To us, that seems like forever and ever ago, time unimaginable compared to our modern society. Hyrule was at its peak of technology 10,000 years before the Breath of the Wild, so even with their doubled lifespan, that's still like 5,000 years to a human, even farther in the past than Abraham. So almost all modern human legends take place at least 1,500 years ago, give or take, and our most prominent myths and legends, like the Trojan War for example, took place 3,500 years ago. This is important to note because this gives us a good idea of how much time generally passes between each Zelda game. Not only do Link and Zelda generally have to live out their lives and die, enough time has to pass between each of the events in the game to allow them to turn into legend as well. Now if you couple that with 200-year generations, we're talking a lot of time, which might make sense as to why the geography of Hyrule changes as much as it seems to in between games. That makes the time periods between each Zelda game, direct sequels excluded, somewhere between 3,000 to 7,000 years. Now there is no mention of a hero in between the present-day Link and the Link that sealed Ganon 10,000 years ago, which directly coincides with our theory of how much time elapses between Zelda titles. However, there is a cutscene in Breath of the Wild in which Zelda drops some very interesting hints that many have come to take as 100% evidence that Breath of the Wild takes place sometime after the Four Swords adventures in the Child Link timeline. However, I do not buy this. Zelda references 3 different instances of the Master Sword specifically in Breath of the Wild: Skyward Bound, Adrift in Time, or Steeped in the Glowing Embers of Twilight. Now this is talking about the Skyward Sword, the Ocarina of Time, and most likely the Twilight Princess. I say most likely because Skyward Bound and Adrift in Time both directly reference the exact name of their games, and it would make sense that the third reference would follow suit. But Twilight has been referenced in other timelines as well, namely the Downfall timeline during A Link to the Past. Twilight is often referenced when talking about the Dark Realm in which Ganon resides. This quote is too ambiguous to close this case and take the Child timeline as fact for the placement of this title. To find where Breath of the Wild takes place in the timeline, we need to figure out exactly where that 10,000 years ago point, again, when Hyrule was at the peak of its technology, started. Frankly, there's only 2 possibilities, and the first possibility I don't love, and it places the start before the Skyward Sword. This is the first game in the canon, so that would make Breath of the Wild take place before Ocarina of Time if this was true, and Skyward Sword also has an awful lot of ancient tech in it, so it would be possible to place the 10,000 years ago point somewhere before it, except for 2 glaring facts. A, there were no divine beasts in the Skyward Sword, and B, the evil faced in the end was Demise, not Ganon. The evil depicted in Cass's tale of the battle that took place 10,000 years before Breath of the Wild was named Ganon, in which he was defeated by the hero, Zelda, the 4 Beasts, and the Guardians. This cutscene can be found at almost any stable in the game. These 2 facts completely wipe Skyward Sword out of the range of possibilities for the placement of Breath of the Wild. There's also too much reference in Breath of the Wild for it to be any kind of prequel game. In fact, everything from characters and music to even geographical areas and enemies were taken from just about every main Zelda game so far. However, we need to look at one specific enemy that exists in not only every main Zelda title, but almost every single Zelda game period, and that is the BMOs. Take a look at the BMOs from the Temple of Time and the Twilight Princess. Now what does that look like to you? Could it be this? Clearly, the BMOs and the Guardians from the Breath of the Wild are connected in some way. The BMOs first appeared in the Skyward Sword, and from then on their appearance varies, but ultimately they're swiveling laser turrets on some kind of base. What's interesting is their design. The laser projected from them always comes out of an eye, symbolism we've seen elsewhere in the Zelda series, which belongs to the ever-watching Sheikah, guardian ninja of the royal bloodline and creators of the great technological masterpieces of destruction that tore down Hyrule 100 years before the Breath of the Wild. These BMOs are without a doubt the creation of the Sheikah, as well as most likely the first iteration of Sheikah technology. As in the Skyward Sword, Fi describes them as being ancient already. So by our previous calculations, with an average of 5,000 years between each game, by the time you see a BMOs in Ocarina of Time, they're 20,000-year-old machines. But as far as tech, this is really all we specifically see from the Sheikah, as an item like the Dominion Rod from the Twilight Princess was a gift to the Sheikah from the Uku, and the Lens of Truth is more magical. Also, we have to remember that much of the technology from the Twilight Princess was Twilight tech, not Sheikah, despite a lot of similarities in architecture and design. It is also important to note that the Sheikah were almost wiped out in the Hyrulean Civil War, which ended right before the Ocarina of Time and is the reason Link was abandoned by his mother in the Kokiri Forest, setting in motion the events of Ocarina. It may have taken many generations to bring the Sheikah back from the brink of extinction, essentially placing Breath of the Wild after the Ocarina of Time. But how far after, and in which timeline? There's some weird stuff going on in the backstory of Breath of the Wild, namely the champions of 100 years past, which consist of a Zora, a Goron, a Gerudo warrior, and a Rito. Okay, let's take a step back and look at what we have here. The Gorons and the Zoras have been seen in the Fallen Hero timeline, the Child Link timeline, and before the split. The Gerudo were only prevalent before the split and in the Child timeline. But the Rito were evolved from Zora after the Great Flood of Hyrule and are only in the Adult Link timeline. But in this wacky world of Shigeru Miyamoto, all these species are together here? What the fuck? It doesn't make any sense at all. It's virtually impossible for these two species to coexist in the same place. Unless this happened after the flooding that happened before the Wind Waker, that doesn't really make any sense. What, were they under the water the entire time? That's impossible. Why would they evolve into the Rito? That doesn't make sense. They're obviously not saltwater animals, freshwater animals, they live in rivers. Anyway, it was at this point in my thinking that I remembered something very important. After the timeline fracture, Link, Zelda, and Ganon still exist in all three timelines at once. See, these three are, for lack of a simple explanation, celestial entities. Gods, kind of, who take a corporeal form every once in a while to preserve a balance of courage, power, and wisdom. There is a lot of religious significance here, so if you're interested, check out Gaijin Goomba's videos on that, which I linked below. He does a great job explaining this in detail. Now, regardless, each character possesses the traits of one corner of the holy symbol, the Triforce. Left behind after the creation of Hyrule by the three goddesses Din, Nayru, and Furore, it's been shown that Zelda, Link, and Ganon are not only timeless but can also exist interdimensionally at the same time. So the Link in the Twilight Princess, A Link to the Past, and the Wind Waker is the same spirit. This is really no different than it being the same Link in Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess, even though those games are in a linear timeline. The past, dimensionally, is no different than a time in a parallel dimension. And that is exactly what the three timelines are. They are three dimensions at the same time in the same place, but because of certain factors, the events and landscapes have changed drastically. However, the protagonists remain the same. Why? Because Zelda, Link, and Ganon are not normal people. They are consistently reincarnated aspects of character, courage, power, and wisdom. Because of the spiritual nature of the trio, Link in the Wind Waker is the same Link that's in the Skyward Sword, and the same Link that is also in the Four Swords Adventures or any other Zelda game. It's another time, another dimension. They're different people, but their essence is part of the same soul, if you will. But because these are reincarnations of one person, there is a collective experience recording all possibilities. Basically, all of the events in all of the games in all of the timelines happened because they were experienced by three singular entities across the board. Did you ever wonder what happens during the times when there is no Link, Zelda, or Ganon? The 3,000 to 7,000 years that takes place in between these tiny little stories we call Zelda games? Well, that's already been answered for you with the concept of a split timeline. Our protagonists are inhabiting other times and other dimensions, waging their three-way war across time and space endlessly. They're a metaphor for constant force, balance. The freaking Triforce, dude. Still though, you can't have a Rito and a Zora existing in the same place at once. It doesn't make any sense. So what am I saying? I'm saying somewhere the timeline was reset once again on a linear path, merging all the characters and events of all the games back into one solid continuity long after the events of the final three games of their respective timelines. That would be the Four Swords Adventures, Zelda 2, and the Spirit Tracks. Now the question is, which timeline did they merge into? In order to get our best guess, we need to look at the maps from the previous games for specific landmarks. For instance, Lake Hylia, Hyrule Castle, Zora's Domain, Death Mountain, the snowy mountains of northwest Hyrule, the canyons, and the Gerudo Desert. It would make sense that the map from the timeline the others melded into would most closely resemble the map of Breath of the Wild. This was actually pretty easy, and the winner was Hyrule from the Downfall timeline. You just gotta twist it a tiny itty bit. Honestly, Ocarina and Twilight Princess are very close as well, especially with the Twilight Princess being the only map with a snowy peak area high in the northwest, as well as sharing similar names of most of its geographical areas. Despite that, the map of A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds is just accurate on an uncanny level, and it can't be ignored. There's little other evidence of which timeline was responsible for being the anchor point of the merge, but I'd like to point out Lionel's real quick. Lionels are boss-like enemies in Breath of the Wild, and their only appearances have been in the Downfall timeline. Couple that with the opening scene of this game being directly cut from the book art of the original Zelda, and it can't be ignored that the basis for Hyrule in the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is from the Downfall timeline. So finally, here is my theory of the placement of Breath of the Wild in the Zelda universe. At some point in the future after Zelda 2, a great catastrophe happened, which could have been similar to the events of Hyrule Warriors, in which the time stream was interrupted yet again, either through the Ocarina of Time, some kind of magic user, or a powerful enemy. The hero and Zelda came forth to protect Hyrule, and in order to do so were forced to enlist the help of multiple allies from across time and space, merging many worlds into one. Presumably the hero was victorious, and in order to prevent the disaster again, the power to alter time was either locked away or destroyed, leaving the new unified Hyrule to figure out a way to defend itself from Ganon in the future. The Sheikah once again began constructing new protective guardians like the BMOs to ensure the safety of the kingdom, thus the creation of the guardian robots we see in the Breath of the Wild, as well as the great guardian beasts named for heroes of time in memoriam. Eventually, Ganon resurfaced and was beaten back by the hero, the guardians, and the beasts so badly that afterwards the guardians were deemed unnecessary and fell mostly to ruin, buried under the sands of time for 10,000 years until they were all but forgotten. That is, until Hyrule was once again threatened and a young Zelda discovers the Guardians, resurrecting them to stand against Ganon alongside Hyrule 100 years before the Breath of the Wild. I would like to thank all of you guys for sticking to the end here with me. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Let me know what you think below. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have any other theories? I would love to hear them. That would be totally awesome. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't subscribed yet, and give the video a like if you liked it. It really helps out and we appreciate it a lot. We got a lot of good stuff coming up for you soon, so make sure you stick around. And if you haven't yet, go check out Motor City Gaming's YouTube channel. That's where I do all my other work. I do editing for them. And go to motorcity.com if you want to see more of my reviews. I'm doing written reviews now for them, so I can get more of them out in a timely manner. Anyway, I am Maikeru. This is Death Mountaineers, and thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.